MICAC is how we abbreviate it. And it's at what used to be called the Mass Military Reservation. We changed our name about a year ago to Joint Base Cape Cod. I don't know if folks saw that in the papers. It's a really big event. Not really. But now we have a new name. It's harder to pronounce. It's Joint Base Cape Cod anyway, JBCC. So I've been at the base since January 1999. My real job is working in the groundwater and soil cleanup for the Air Force. And I have a quick story about why we ended up putting up some turbines. So without further ado. Joint Base Cape Cod is 22,000 acres on the Upper Cape. It's actually 10% of the land mass of the Cape Cod. Most people don't realize how big it is. Next slide. And it's a multi-use facility, hence the name change from Mass Military Reservation to Joint Base Cape Cod. And the primary agencies out there are the Army National Guard, Air National Guard, regular Air Force, and Coast Guard. Probably all aware of those. And then there's also the VA Cemetery, but there's a number of other tenants and other things going on out at the base that keeps us kind of busy. But in our program, we're considered a tenant there. We don't own any property or anything, but we're part of the Air Force. And again, we're there to clean up the environment from past practices that have contaminated it. Soil contamination, groundwater contamination. These are just some photos of past practices that have caused the contamination, like aircraft maintenance, underground storage tanks. We have Beaumont missiles there, so the different types of operations and maintenance associated with that program, as well as fire training activities, where they would basically pour anything on the ground that would burn and ignite it and practice putting it out to simulate, what would they do if a plane caught on fire and they want to put it out. But what they didn't know is, next slide, when you pour stuff like that on the ground, and this was years and years ago, decades ago, the base has been around since the early 1920s, I believe. But the soil contamination, as it rains, it drives it down to the aquifer, and on the Upper Cape, we all get our drinking water from the sole source aquifer, which is called Sagamore Lens. So these areas of colors on the outline of the base are they're areas of groundwater contamination. And I should probably just go up there and play with my hands about these dots here and this infrastructure. Those are all extraction wells and pipeline that we put in to treat the contamination. There's actually two programs, the Air Force and the Army program, and we're both doing quite a bit of remediation, and it's all active pump and treat. So you're pumping, you're moving water over great distances. We have over 27 miles of pipeline on and off the base. So you can imagine that takes a lot of energy. And we have in the Air Force program, we have 9 pump and treat systems, and they're located in these circular areas on and off the base. And it's just driving home the distance that we have to pump the water to these individual treatment plants. This is just one of the treatment plants that we've installed. It's one of our largest. Each one of those tanks that you see there, those have calcium carbon in them. They're kind of really big Brita filters that you might put on your faucet to clean your water. They each hold 20,000 pounds of carbon. So it's a very big effort. And you can see the size, you can see the workers here compared to the size of the tanks. Next slide, please. So that's just a very quick overview. I mean, I could talk about our program for days, but so this is, say, one of our treatment plants, and this is how we remove the contamination. We deal with volatile organic compounds like trichloroethane and perchloroethane. We pump it up out of the water, we send it through those carbon vessels, and then we put it back in the aquifer clean. Well, here we are cleaning up the groundwater, but we started assessing how much air pollution we're creating by using the power from some fossil fuel power plants with the New England mix. And we found that we were actually creating more contamination in the air than what we were removing from the groundwater. So we said, we have to do this better, we need to be more sustainable. That's why we looked at different types of renewable energy. We looked at solar and discovered that with our program using 12,000 megawatt hours a year and electricity, over $2.5 million in electricity costs just for our program, that solar wasn't going to cut it. And that's when we started looking into it. So we have 2 wind projects, one in the lower southwest corner of the base, here behind base housing, and the other one's located up by the Sagamore Bridge. The one in the southwest corner is a Furlander wind turbine. I'm not sure if you've heard of those before. They're really not around anymore. The company has since gone bankrupt, and I believe I don't know if they're still doing business in Europe, but they're not doing business in the United States anymore. But we have a Furlander, and it's a 1.5 megawatt. It's your standard 80-meter hub height, 77-meter rotor diameter, and it's which I think takes up to about 390 feet total height. And there's just some statistics about it. But really, the point of this presentation is just giving an update on how it's doing and how all of our wind turbines are doing. So the Furlander started operation in December 2009, and it actually took us 5 years. Megan's like, 5 years. 5 years to put the turbines up. From the concept anyway, to find out if we can use cleanup funds to do this, to when we actually constructed it. We were expecting to produce about 3,800 megawatt hours annually, based on a 29% capacity factor. We're now, 4.5 years into it, and we realized it wasn't meeting the 29% capacity factor. It's more around 25%, and that has to do with some of the issues that we've had with the turbine, with operation, as well as the location with the wind speed. So we're at around 25% capacity factor now, and you can see the actual production since startup. It's just about 12,500 megawatt hours. That's through April. And so far, the program's received a credit of about $1.8 million from this wind turbine. And that goes directly against the credit through net metering on our accounts. Now we were doing some rough calculations with return on investments and how long it will take to pay this turbine back. And we were coming up with about 10 years. That doesn't account for a gearbox exchange that we now have to do. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Next slide. Oh, some folks are just interested in how close we are to base housing, since it is in that area. This is the yellow box on the left side, and this is where the turbine went in. It says proposed, it's a little slide. And then this is where housing is. So we're about 1,180 feet from the closest housing resident. And we've had no complaints with the turbine. Some of our startup issues, this is going back to 2009, of course, and it didn't ramp up to 100% at first. So I don't know how many people are thinking about putting up a turbine, but there are some things you just have to look out for. And a lot of it has to do with programming. If your SCADA is not programmed correctly, you're going to have problems like this. It didn't go up to 100%. We fixed that. Auto restart wouldn't work, so we would have to go out there and reset it. And that was a programming issue. The turbine wasn't responding well to gusts, which, as you know, around this area, we do have a lot of gusts. It turns out it was an encoder, which basically reads the RPMs of the generator. So once we found that out, we were able to replace that and fix that problem. We had some issues with the nacelle lighting. It was very dim, and it was just the type of light that came with the turbine, so we basically replaced it. And a lot of people, if it doesn't turn from white strobe during the day to red strobe at night, I do get calls about that. So we want to make sure that's operating properly. And also, we had some issues with our remote monitoring. It just wasn't ready. We eventually got the software, but it wasn't available to start up. And these are the kind of things that you really need to ask if you're considering purchasing a turbine. Does it come with software? And is it ready to operate? Plus license agreements, you want to make sure those are finalized in advance. It's kind of hard though. We had some administrative issues, which I have another slide about, dealing with Germans, just time difference, language barriers, and such. These are some of the operational issues that we've experienced over the 4.5 years. Again, the encoder, this was the original one that came with the machine, but it wasn't really set up for our gusts. And after changing about 5 of them, at $300 a piece, we said, no, let's try a more beefier one. And it turns out that type worked. So we learned that lesson. Backup batteries that we got. The turbine goes through a self-health check, and it will check the backup batteries. And if they're dead, like brand new but dead, the turbine won't run. So it turns out that even though you get a brand new turbine, sometimes your batteries are very old. So you want to make sure those are charged up properly and you get new ones and that they hold a charge. The generator brushes, we've had issues with some of them more earlier. These are pieces of carbon that basically make the contact between the spinning generator and the output. And if once they wear down, you have to replace them. But they really should last a lot longer than they did in our case. So we found that that was a problem. And I think one of the biggest things that we discovered is the fault code that you receive when you have these operational problems. It might tell you something just very general, like power supply error. You're like, what is that? Is that a backup battery, or is it not getting power? Or rotor bearing error. And you go, okay, so it would be just nicer to get more specific error that told you where the problem was. And then we had some lightning strikes. These are large items, standing out there in the weather, and they are susceptible to lightning strikes. We have a great grounding grid in ours, but we still have had some damage. The bearings and the isolation disc was targeted, and we had to replace those. Isolation disc is about this big, about, 3 feet in diameter, and weighs about 300 pounds. And we had to do that by hand. And then the gearbox failed. This is one of the Yake Yano Kesterman gearboxes that have failed in Princeton. Princeton's lasted, I think, one of their turbines lasted 1 year. And then the one in Portsmouth, Rhode Island has a similar, I think actually exactly the same gearbox. There have been 3 or so out in California. I keep hearing these anecdotal stories about what gearboxes are failing, but ours did. We actually thought it was going to fail within the first 2 years. It was showing signs, but it lasted another 2.5 years, and now the gig is up, and we have to replace it. We had a borescope inspection that said, yeah, don't run this gearbox anymore. But the thing is, a lot of people think, well, if the gearbox fails, the thing's going to fly apart or catch on fire. No, what happened was it went down on a low oil pressure, because it just wasn't getting the oil pressure through. So we said, okay, something's wrong. We went up there and took a look at it and realized that it was the gearbox. We also, again, lightning. These plastic pieces used to be placed on the ends of blades. I'm not sure if they are still, but ours there's a ground grid, there's a cable, a copper cable that goes from the end of the blade, takes it up into the nacelle. And then that would get hit, but it's supposed to, because it takes the energy away from the lightning. But in the meantime, it also bubbled up this piece of plastic. Not an operational issue, really. I mean, it would, if we didn't change it out or take it off, it would cause some inefficiencies over time. But what it does is it makes noise. So you get like maybe a whistle of the blade. So next time we had a blade inspection done, we said, take those things off, and that's what they did. They just repaired the end of the blade, and we don't use them anymore. But that's just something to watch out for. You don't really need these. I think they just put them on for protection. This is a bridge rectifier. It monitors grid power. This is one of those, your fault is a grid power. Okay. And it turned out it was this little tiny piece that cost about $200. It's literally about that big. And it probably cost us a few $1,000s in downtime. This is a chopping resistor. This one I hate the most because it told us we had a yaw, some kind of a yaw fault, and we didn't know exactly where it was. It had gone on for about 1.5 years, and what would happen is, in the gusty conditions, the turbine would run for about 10 minutes and then shut down for 2 minutes. Then it would start itself back up. You can imagine how hard that is on the equipment, and that probably had something to do with our gearbox going bad early as well. Eventually we found out by talking to somebody who really knows, this is an AMST WindTech design type turbine. He really knows turbines. His name's Sean Hodgson. He's like, oh, you should try to change out the chopping resistor. And as soon as we did that, that problem went away. It was too bad it took us 1.5 years to figure it out. Because one of the excuses we got from our service and our Furlander folks was, oh, that's just the way they operate. No. No. This was the lightning damage I mentioned earlier. This is the isolation disc, this piece here, and this is the bearing. So all that was done just by hand with a couple of our O&M technicians. Service issues I talked about a little bit already, just working with Furlander. They're kind of out of the picture now, but if you are working with a foreign supplier, you may have some of these issues as well. Just, again, language barrier, time difference. Germans love to take vacations, so they're almost, I think they have a 3-day work week. So it was really difficult. sorry. That's my experience. Next slide. Move on. So now I'm going to talk about the second project up here north by the Sagamore Bridge. Now you see 2 turbines in this picture, and obviously if you're up the Sagamore Bridge you see 4 now. That's because Forbes was looking at ours and saying that's a pretty good idea, and then they went and they put their 2 in, but we just don't have an aerial photo of those 2 right now. So those are GE turbines. These started up in November 2011. This was a 2-year project, so from concept to construction we went from 5 years to 2 years because we streamlined things, we learned our lessons, and we just knew how to do things better. Expectations are producing about 7,600 megawatt hours annually based on 29% capacity factor. These things are dead bang on. They actually could be better. We've had a few issues, like NSTAR doing work on the transmission lines, so we had to shut down our substation for weeks. So that affected the capacity factor. And we've had some operational issues with the GEs, but they overall have been running a lot better than the Furlander. So far, let's see, we've got a credit of $2.5 million through April, and this ROI is about 10 years as well because we had to build our own 7.5 MVA substation because we were connecting to transmission, not distribution. Next.
Your actual capacity factor also lower for the GEs?
No, it's about
They have a 29%
yeah.
predicted.
Dead bang on. We did have some construction issues. This one just blew my mind. It was just a simple matter of conversion from English to metric. And what happened was the bolts were too big for the flange holes in some cases because of this conversion factor. So you can see the calipers here. It's like the bolt is 38, whatever it is, millimeters, and the hole is 37. It doesn't take a rocket science to figure out that's not going to fit. So GE was great. They came to the site, they milled out the flanges, and it only took like maybe another week. But meanwhile, we were still doing things with construction, so it really didn't blow us up that much. But you never think about it. One of the things with these GE turbines, and I don't know if this is the case with some of the other ones, but GE has generator cooling fans in their nacelles. And the first one, we have 2 turbines, the first one failed within 2 weeks, the day of our ribbon cutting ceremony, of course. And we're like, well, why is something new failing so soon? Turns out that these particular ones are the older models, and what they do is they just wait for them to fail. They know they're going to fail. They're just going to wait until, and then they go replace them. Why don't you replace it when the nacelle is on the ground or in the factory with a new version of it so it doesn't fail? And sure enough, a month later, or a few weeks later, our second one failed. You guys? But we were under warranty. It was a matter of now being down for a few days because the cooling fan's not working. Again, we had a problem with the nacelle light. It didn't switch from the white strobe during the day to the red at night, so it was blinking, and it was a foggy night, so it was like, lightning storm, lightning storm, lightning storm. I actually got a complaint from somebody who knows me. We lived 5 miles away. Man. We fixed it the next day. It was just a matter of changing the switches. We also did have a small oil leak in the filter housing, and this is the filter. We just had to replace it. These are things you have to watch for, or if you don't replace them, obviously they can get worse over time. Just the details, and I'll leave this presentation. I imagine Jody will be sending it out to everybody. So that's all the details. If you ever want to know that we use the Manitowoc 16,440-ton crane with 350 foot mast. Yeah. This is the performance chart, and these are for the GEs. And when I said the 29% capacity factor, that's what this green line is. And then these red bars are, I believe, monthly energy production in megawatt hours. And then this blue is the actual cumulative energy production based on that 29% capacity factor. So it's pretty much right in line, and in fact, in some cases, did better overall. So it kind of averages out to be about 29%, which I thought these GEs were going to be more like 32 or 35%. I guess one can always hope, cross your fingers that they're going to do better. Furlander, we've had some issues over time that I touched on. And it's really about the slope when you look at the slope matching this. So it is about the 25%, but you can see the cumulative energy production has decreased over time more than expected. because of some of the issues that we had to deal with. This is one of my favorite charts. December 2009 is when the Furlander went up. This red bar is how much energy our program uses. The blue bar is how much the wind turbines produce. You can see the Furlander was producing maybe about 25% to 30% of our total energy. And then in November 2011, when the GEs came online, we were actually producing more than what we were using. So what we intended to do, and what is turning out to be the case, is we're averaging it across the year. And with net metering, thank you Massachusetts and the Green Community Act, with net metering, we're allowed to keep those credits, and we're pretty much 100% offset by renewable energy with our program now. And this is going forward. This is our past energy use. These are the turbines coming online, and these are our projections. Now, this is probably going to go down a little bit because turbines become less efficient over time. But also our program, as we clean up the groundwater and shut down extraction wells and treatment plants, we're also going to be using less energy. So we have this delta that we're going to have to figure out what to do with very soon, like this year. I have 4 slides of lessons learned, but I don't want to take up all your time, so I'm just going to go through. Communication is always really important. Most people realize that. Working with NSTAR is very important. I have lots of stories about logistics, but can't go into those right now. Moving superloads across state highways and bridges and such. Nils knows that firsthand because he got stuck behind one of our blades because they went off route. That's why. They shouldn't do that. Inspect the manufacturing facilities if possible, especially if you're working with a turbine company that's not well represented, like GE has tens of thousands of turbines. You want to make sure they're actually making them. Next. Do spare parts come with a wind turbine purchase? You want to check. And just because they're new doesn't necessarily mean they'll work. That's always something to be aware of. FAA, we had a number of presumed hazards that we negotiated with them. They raised the minimum vectoring altitude, so you have there's ways to work with FAA if you get a presumed hazard. Anchor bolts being sized correctly, we talked about that. This was true way back when in 2009. There was a long lead time on turbines, not so much anymore. If you can find a direct drive turbine, I don't know what the pros think about this. They don't have gearboxes though, so that sounds kind of good to me. Evaluate warranties, service contracts, conduct end of warranty inspections. I've gone through a number of American Wind Energy Association conferences, and they're really harping on this. So at the end of warranty, get somebody who's a third-party person to come in, who's unbiased, to do an inspection of your turbine. Don't plan a ribbon cutting ceremony until turbine's out. Just quick, we have other energy projects at Joint Base Cape Cod. It's not all wind. We are working on a multi-megawatt solar array to be installed on our closed landfill. So great use of space like that. There's 2 geothermal systems that the Coast Guard has in their hangars. They use them for heating and cooling. VA Cemetery has a cute little 50 kilowatt wind turbine on their property. And we're constantly looking at ways to do things better and cheaper to save energy. EPA actually funded the feasibility study for the solar array, and NREL conducted it. We're getting very close to selecting the contractor next. And this is just an aerial of it, of the landfill cap. And this is a picture, the next one here. So this is what the landfill cap looks like. It's got the front line in the background. It just looks like a really nice place for solar. And that's it. Questions?
Okay, thank you very much, Rose. Is there 1 or 2 questions? Anybody has a question for Rose, or you can talk to her after the meeting also. Okay, fine. I'd like to introduce now Liz Argo, who many of you know, from the Cape and Vineyard Electricity Cooperative, who will now moderate our panel on offshore wind.
And the first thing I'm going to do is ask Mark to tell me which one is his presentation. I'm sorry, it's going to be Nils. So Nils, where's your presentation?
Still on flash drive.
Yeah, where's it called?
It starts with a date. There you go.
Is it
Right there.
Excellent. So Nils Bolgen is the program director at the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. He's now the wind program director. Massachusetts Clean Energy Center is a public agency dedicated to accelerating the success of clean energy. They have quite a successful track record. In his role, Nils oversees incentive programs and related efforts to advance land-based and offshore wind energy development in Massachusetts. So he's had a hand in quite a few of the projects locally. Prior to joining Mass Clean Energy Center, Nils worked in a similar capacity for a range of renewable energy technologies at the Massachusetts Technology Collaborative, which was somewhat the predecessor to the Clean Energy Center. Nils has also served in program administration and regulation development roles at the Massachusetts Division of Energy Resources. Nils has a Bachelor of Sciences degree in physics and a Master of Environmental Planning degree. So without further ado, I can bump the slides for you, Nils.
Would you please? Thank you. Okay, I'm going to try to blast through quite quickly. Thank you, Liz. I'll just give a brief overview and orientation of offshore wind activities in the region and talk about a couple specific projects that we have going on at the Clean Energy Center. Next slide. Offshore wind energy, I borrowed these slides, some of these slides from other people. I would quibble with the first word. It's not a new technology, it's new to this country in terms of having operational experience, but offshore wind has been around for more than 20 years in Europe. But it is relatively higher cost, that's a bit of a challenge. The resource is very large, it's very close to the major load centers. That turns out to be a big advantage in terms of getting your clean energy to where it's needed. It's also highly coincident with the electric system peak loads, or at least more coincident than land-based wind and solar, for example, that adds value to the energy that you get out of it. It's also a potential economic development engine, a potential part of the answer to climate change, and also part of a response to the growing trend of retirements of some of our fossil-based plants in the region, particularly coal and nuclear, which is not fossil, but you get the idea. Next slide, please. We have a strong sort of policy basis for advancing clean energy in Massachusetts, very aggressive renewable portfolio standard, carbon reduction targets, policies for utilities to do long-term contracts with generators so they can get financed. We have a lot of stakeholder engagement going on with respect to the offshore planning areas that we'll show in a minute. And then we have some specific activities which I'll skip through because they're covered later. So the east coast of the U.S., there are a number of offshore wind planning areas up and down the coast, mostly in federal waters. So various public agencies and developers work with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is under the U.S. Department of Interior. Up here in the northeast, you have the green one, which is the Massachusetts wind energy area, probably the larger of them all. And then the orangish, it's in two pieces there, is the what they call the REMA, the Rhode Island, Massachusetts area. So let's take just a little bit closer look at this region. Just want to flag sort of where people are doing some offshore wind projects. First of all, Cape Wind in Nantucket Sound, probably the most familiar to everyone. We have their operations base in Falmouth marked there. Just a little bit to the west, along Buzzards Bay, is the site of the New Bedford Marine Commerce Terminal. You'll hear a little bit more about that this afternoon. But then looking down to the south in the deeper federal waters, you have the Massachusetts wind energy area, this sort of odd-looking shape with a goatee, and then the Rhode Island, Massachusetts area, which abuts it and has sort of a carve-out for, I think, fishing grounds in the middle of it. And then off a little bit to the west is the Deepwater Wind project off Block Island, the demonstration project. You can probably hear some more about that also. Mass wind area, just key point there, the wind is great. The water depths, 35 to 65 meters. 35 to 50 is sort of within the range of, I think, current support structures. When you get to the lower half here, to the south and west, if you will, when you get over 50 meters, that becomes a little bit more challenging for today. But the overall development capacity, according to an analysis by NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, is that you could develop up to 5 gigawatts or 5,000 megawatts of generating capacity there. So obviously you could start in the more shallow areas. We're not going to do 5 gigawatts right away, that's for sure. Next slide, please. And then the REMA, Rhode Island, Massachusetts area, this was the first area that Bowen conducted a competitive lease auction for in July of last year. Deepwater Wind won that auction, and Deepwater has been engaged with the state of Rhode Island for a long time. So they own the leases there, and I think up to 1.2 gigawatts or 1,200 megawatts is what could be installed there. Okay, so that's kind of the lay of the land. Now, just a few of the activities that the Mass CDC is sponsoring to help map out development in the Massachusetts and to some degree the REMA areas and accelerate the development process. First of all, impact on whales, turtles, and birds is something that folks are concerned about in these areas. So we're now in our third year of sponsoring field surveys to catalog and count the presence of whales, sea turtles, and birds in this area. The primary tool is aerial surveys. They fly from Plymouth Airport. They run these, I think, 7 nautical mile spaced transects with observers in the plane and documents what they see, both visually and transcribing onto a laptop, but also with photographs. Also, for the whales, we have a set of acoustic buoys that are installed and just left there for 6 months at a time and then retrieved. And various whales have different acoustic signatures, and by analyzing the data from the buoys, we can get an idea for the presence, number, and type of whales that are in the area. Another thing that we want to get out of offshore wind development is we really need to grow this whole industry in the region. There are many companies around the region that have skills and capabilities that can be used for offshore wind turbines or the development process, support structures, things like that. So we have contracted with Global Wind Network to help do some networking between existing industries in the region for now. Now, the city of New Bedford did this first, just in the New Bedford immediate area. We expanded to the South Coast region, and now we're expanding to the Worcester and Springfield areas. But the idea is just to make connections between wind developers, turbine manufacturers, and companies that can be part of the supply chain too. Next slide. Another project that we've been focusing on more recently is sort of the question, okay, if you could build even 2 or 3 gigawatts between the two development areas, where can we interconnect that to our electric system? What are the locations? How much is it going to cost? Do we have to do major expansions to the existing network? We launched last fall a transmission project to just look at those questions. We're not going into the business of building transmission, but we just want to understand better what the lay of the land looks like. Let's go to the next slide. So here you see the 2 planning areas. And the first question is, where can you inject this power? The red lines are all the high voltage transmission lines in the southeastern portion of New England, 345 kilovolts. Where are the substations that are associated with those high voltage lines? We have 6 or 7 of them identified here. Oak Street in, I think it's Barnstable, the Canal Power Plant in Sandwich, State Forest, that's actually Plymouth State Forest. It's not really a substation, but it's an interesting area of convergence of lines, at least to the electrical engineers. Carver has a big substation. Then you have Brayton Point, which is a large power plant already, coal-powered, which is in the process of retiring. So there's a lot of ability to move power out of that region that could potentially be replaced with offshore wind energy. Kent in Rhode Island along 95, and then down in Connecticut, the Millstone nuclear plant. I think there were originally planned to be 3 units at Millstone. There are only 2 operating now, so there's already some extra capacity there. And then Montville, a little bit further up one of the rivers in Connecticut. So we haven't finished the study on this and the report. It's coming out hopefully in a week or 2. But the bottom line is between all of these stations, each one individually can handle between half a gigawatt and in some cases 1 or 2 gigawatts of new power. If, for example, that canal, if the canal power plant retires, which is also being covered. So the takeaway is that with all of these possible locations, the answer is yes, you can bring all this power into the grid. And we're also looking at, well, what would you have to do to the major transmission lines? And so far the answer seems to be not much, because you're already going in at a very high voltage and you can move the power out from there, and you're right in the vicinity of where the power is needed. So those are all great advantages. Just a little bit look at, we've been looking at high voltage DC as the technology for this. Just schematically, the pieces here, the wind turbines, there'll be a lot of collector cables from each turbine to an AC collector substation. And then there'd be a high voltage AC cable that goes to a converter station, big platform out in the water that would convert the AC to the DC power. This would be relatively short distances here, but then the DC cable that's 30 to 80, 90 miles as far as you need to go to get to one of those substations. And the advantage of DC is it's more efficient. Then you get back either on land as close as possible to the substation, you got to convert it back to AC. So those are the major components. Last thing I wanted to just mention is a lot of logistics involved in building an offshore wind plant. Large blades, tower components, nacelles, and the loads are quite heavy. So several years ago, Mass CEC launched an effort to build a purpose-built port facility in New Bedford that can handle these heavy loads and ideally be used as a staging area for Cape Wind and the other projects that we hope to see develop in these other areas. Next slide, please. So Mass CEC is building this. This is a picture of the site taken last summer. You see off in the distance is the hurricane barrier, the stone area that protects the New Bedford Harbor during severe storms. That has gates that close to protect the harbor in the event of a storm. This area, all in the foreground, is what will be the commerce terminal. And the next slide. So this picture shows it just about a month ago. What you see here, these structures are coffer, C-O-F-F-E-R, comes from French for a chest or container. Coffer dam, you just drive long sheets of steel down into the seabed, form the circle, and then what they've done here on the side is filled them with dense material and really compacted it. And when they complete that wall, that becomes a retaining wall, if you will. Then they finish backfilling and compacting the broader expanse of the port area in the background, and that gives the load carrying capability that you need for these wind turbine components. It's on schedule to be completed at the end of this year, and that was supposed to be a segue, I think, to the next speaker.
Great.
what is it? Yeah, John is 3.5. And
Well, while
Matthew
she's loading
is
the
10
presentation.
months, yeah. I would agree. He's 10 months now.
I did. I did it around 4 o'clock today.
I took down 10
It's on video.
I had to see him have those things for me. I don't think I realized it all on. I had 2 of them.
So Lauren Cassell is an economic development specialist at the New Bedford Wind Energy Center. We were just talking about the New Bedford Marine Center. The New Bedford Wind Energy Center was established within the New Bedford Economic Development Council to ensure that the activities to develop offshore wind industry are fully integrated into the city's comprehensive economic agenda. The Wind Energy Center is the platform that builds local capacity around offshore wind development in New Bedford. Its mission is to fully capture all of the opportunities possible for maximum job creation, investment, and positive impact throughout the community from offshore wind.
Perfect. So thank you, everyone, for having me today. So again, coming from the New Bedford Wind Energy Center, and Nils did a fantastic job of sort of providing an overview of what's happening from an infrastructure standpoint in New Bedford, but I'd love to just go through some of the context from an economic development and jobs growth standpoint, which is what we focus on for the Wind Energy Center. So just to give you guys some geographic context, New Bedford is right here. We're right here in Duxbury right now, but pretty strategically located near some of the key areas in southern New England. So New Bedford is a small city, population of about 100,000 people, but we have a rich cultural, maritime, textile history. We were founded in 1787, and we were at one time the richest whaling port in the United States. We have a long-standing history of kind of a working waterfront and working on the harbor. Today, we're the #1 valued commercial fishing port in America, and we're the #1 new growth gateway city in the Commonwealth. So there's quite a bit of economic development going on in the city right now, sort of outside of just the offshore wind piece. And some fun facts about New Bedford. America is the 7th most artistic city, so we have a really strong cultural and artistic vibe going on in the city as well. And we're also one of America's 50 top sailing destinations, as according to Yachting Magazine, so it's a great recreational port as well. So if we zoom in from the map that we just showed you, this is New Bedford's sort of key infrastructural assets. We have great highway access here. You can see this is kind of our core downtown area, and it's very much intrinsically tied to the working waterfront here. Again, big fishing port. A lot of that happens around here. The New Bedford Marine Commerce Terminal, which Nils was just talking about, is currently under construction right here, just inside the hurricane barrier. We also have a regional airport, an industrial park, and some larger educational institutions like UMass Dartmouth, UCC is right in the downtown, and then our surrounding communities. So just from an economic development standpoint, my background is in economic development, and the Wind Energy Center sort of lies within the New Bedford Economic Development Council. So in the past 10 years, really picking up in the last 5, we've had a big jump in private investment, public investment, jobs retained and created, and new and expanding businesses in the downtown. We're pretty proud about the fact that through the recession in 2008, we opened up, actually 55 is an outdated number. I think in the last 5 years, we've opened or retained 58 businesses just in the downtown, which is, for us, a pretty impressive number. Next slide. Next slide again. But of course, if anyone is familiar with New Bedford, it's not without its challenges. We still struggle with, I think we compete with Lawrence for the highest unemployment rate in Massachusetts, which is pretty depressing. I think it actually lowered to 11.2% in April from 14. And to give you some reference, Massachusetts average unemployment rate is around 7% right now. So high unemployment rate, high dropout rate in the high school, low educational attainment levels, increased fishing regulations, which really poses a threat to our fishing economy, as well as aging infrastructure and housing stock. So sort of to give you that economic development context, we move on to, why we're thinking about offshore wind in New Bedford and what are some of the reasons that we felt offshore wind was a really kind of generational opportunity for our city. All of you guys know this. CO2 levels are rising, greenhouse gases are rising. The IPCC just came out with a report, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, that really shifted the tone on climate change. I mean, we all know that climate change is real, but the report was pretty significant in that it's a clear shift in the Obama administration's tone in addressing climate change. Next slide. This is a little bit of a misleading slide here because it looks as though Boston is supplying all of these distributed energy sources, but it's very much the opposite. Massachusetts actually does not create or generate much of its energy, and as Nils mentioned, with power plants like Brayton Point coming offline in the next few years, there's a significant gap in the Massachusetts energy pipeline. As a result, we have some of the most expensive energy costs in the United States. So naturally, we should be looking for domestic and locally sourced energy sources. So this is just a slide from NREL, and it shows sort of the wind resources up and down the east and west coast of the United States. Red and brown tones obviously show average wind speeds that are higher, concentrated along Massachusetts and up to the Maine coast, as well as the west coast over here. So, what this means for us is that there is a tremendous amount of wind energy just off of our coast. Wind energy is unlimited, and it's cheap, and it's not going to run out anytime soon. In addition to that, we did a lot of study just on our end on sort of the European experience of offshore wind. Offshore wind has existed in Europe for over 20 years. They've had a really thriving industry. They've experienced some setbacks in the last 5 years or so, and growth has slowed just a little bit. But we really wanted to focus in on these two communities, Cuxhaven and Bremerhaven, because they have some striking similarities to New Bedford's economy. Both post-industrial communities with a strong tie to their working waterfront, who suffered some pretty significant losses in a post-industrial era. So particularly Bremerhaven in 2002 had a 24% unemployment rate, and in part because of their offshore wind development have moved up to about 10%, which is still not great, but offshore wind has played a really huge role in their economic recovery. We're actually we're a sister, New Bedford is a sister city with Cuxhaven, and we have some pretty close ties with Bremerhaven as well. And we work with their stakeholders and representatives on a regular basis to sort of gain some lessons learned and develop greater ties with the manufacturing facilities and offshore wind development companies that are in Europe today. And this is just another photo. I mean, if we go back, you can see Bremerhaven sort of in their heyday, but this is Cuxhaven and Bremerhaven today, and these are two huge offshore wind working ports. So this is sort of an antiquated photo at this point, because you have these great updated photos, Nils, of the Marine Commerce Terminal, but from our perspective, this is where the Marine Commerce Terminal lies. This is kind of Route 18, a major artery throughout New Bedford, and this is the hurricane barrier right here. This is the footprint that the Marine Commerce Terminal is currently under construction. So if you go to the next slide, this is sort of a general layout of what the offshore wind components and assembly pieces will look like, how we'll sort of arrange them. These are some deployment boats off the side of the quayside, and you can see some blades lined up here. These are blades and different components. Next slide. And I like this sketch. It just kind of shows what the Marine Commerce Terminal will look like once it's in sort of full operation. Whether it's entirely accurate or not, I'm not sure, but we like to show it as sort of a promise to what we can look forward to in New Bedford. So Nils just showed the slide. I don't want to repeat myself too much, but the New Bedford Marine Commerce Terminal is here. And as we view it from an economic development standpoint, we have the Cape Wind lease area right here, and then this, Deepwater Wind just won this lease for the Rhode Island, Massachusetts wind energy area. But for us, sort of the economic opportunity lies in the subsequent leases that are going to happen through the delineation of the Massachusetts wind energy area as well. Over the next 10 years, as the industry emerges, we're really looking forward to being one of the first movers in offshore wind deployment and assembly facilities. Saw this slide again as well, and all this shows for us, of course, here's the Massachusetts wind energy area, big green hunk, kind of the largest planning area up and down the East Coast. But for us, what it really means is that this is a regional push. New Bedford is not going to be, hopefully not going to be the only port that is deploying offshore wind components and pieces, because that would be a pretty sad indicator of the industry. We're very much looking forward to kind of seeing many ports come out and bring their planning sites to fruition and seeing the industry emerge. Can go, if you go like 2, 3, 4, we can. Perfect. So from a local, state, federal policy standpoint, we're very much kind of monitoring, especially on a federal level and on a state level, what's happening with renewable energy policy. And currently, our Mayor Mitchell out of the city of New Bedford, Governor Patrick, and President Obama are all very much aligned in incentivizing and supporting renewable energy development. But it very much is kind of a tenuous and ongoing process. There's a lot of challenges that lay ahead in terms of policy and sort of getting through, the first crucial incentives that we need for offshore wind to develop. So I would say, in terms of market data pointing to confidence, we are cautiously optimistic in the offshore wind industry emerging. So bringing it back to New Bedford, this is a slide that we use all the time to kind of articulate how we think about our economic development strategy from a city standpoint. This came out of our comprehensive master city plan that we did a few years back to kind of think strategically about how economic development happens throughout the city of New Bedford, regardless of what specific industry we're focusing on. So this is our 10-year plan for sustainable economic development. What we'd like to focus on as an economic development agency is supporting existing and small businesses that are already in New Bedford, catalyzing and supporting emerging job sectors, communicating those opportunities both within the community and sort of outside of the community as well. We are heavily focused on sound planning and development efforts within the city. We're just about to undergo a pretty large waterfront planning study funded by the EDA. We just received a grant from the EDA for, I think it's $400,000 to do a comprehensive waterfront planning study, which we're pretty excited about. And then, of course, workforce investment and catalytic projects. So across the board, we tend to kind of filter our focus areas as economic development practitioners through these 6 areas. Next slide, I think. Yes. So if we go back to kind of our history, our whaling history in New Bedford, if we're thinking about this from a supply chain and job standpoint, right, we have these core jobs that were thriving on the New Bedford waterfront. We come from pretty good stock. We were blacksmiths, we were sailmakers, we were shipbuilders. If we go to the next slide, New Bedford's economy also really thrived in sort of the secondary markets that rippled throughout our economy. We weren't just shipbuilders, we were also oil refiners, we were tailors, we were bakers. And as a result, a wide array of markets and individuals benefited from the whaling industry. So if you go to the next slide. In the next slide, we are thinking about offshore wind in the same way. These are sort of the primary markets that we tend to focus on from an industry standpoint: offshore logistics, engineers, onshore handling, captains and deckhands. The GLWN study that Nils mentioned earlier has really focused in on what those jobs look like and how some of our local supply chain participants can really get in on the ground floor with these types of jobs. But on a second level, and from an economic development standpoint, we also really want to think about how offshore wind will be able to, of course, benefit manufacturing opportunities in sort of the later phases of development. But we also want to focus on how, increased activity on the waterfront will benefit retail, restaurants, hotels, fueling, repair mechanics, things like that. And for us, that's really where kind of the workforce development opportunity comes from. It's not just sort of the highly technical engineers and high-skilled jobs, which we want to come to New Bedford, because those don't really exist right now. But there's sort of this second level of opportunity that we really want to remain sort of aware of. Next slide. So structurally, where are we? It's a little confusing. On our business card, we're very conscious of putting both the MBEDC logo and the Wind Energy Center logo right next to each other. We are sort of intrinsically tied because our activities are intrinsically tied. So we have the MBEDC and the board of directors. We have our executive director, and we sort of sit alongside our existing real estate development, business assistance, and lending units as well. So we are sort of a small enclave within a larger portfolio of economic development initiatives in the city. So you can go to the next slide. And of course, as we view it, offshore wind kind of transcends all six of our kind of six-pillar strategy for economic development. As such, we, in developing kind of the business plan for the Wind Energy Center, it's a fairly new entity. We were formed in August of 2013, so we haven't been around for that long. But in kind of the early stages of planning for the Wind Energy Center, we decided that these key areas were what we wanted to focus on, so that we were benefiting both the residents of New Bedford who want jobs, who want to see some real growth in the community, and so that we could benefit and advocate for sound policy and planning from an industry level for offshore wind development. And that's it. I mean, I can go through kind of what we're doing in each of these, but I think it'd probably be more expedient that if any of you are interested in those areas, I can answer any questions.
Excellent. Next, we have Mark Rogers. I don't think we have to say too much about Mark Rogers. Most of us have seen him because we've all been waiting for years for Cape Wind to get even to where it is. So it's a major accomplishment that it's in the pre-construction stage. So Mark Rogers is the communications director. Have you had any other titles added to your?
No.
Okay. So Mark does not have a presentation, so take it away, Mark.
Yeah, hi. Mark Rogers, Cape Wind. I'm going to be fairly brief. It was a little over a year ago, I think about 16 months ago, that I last was on a panel in front of this group talking about Cape Wind. So to look at the last 16 months, we've really made a lot of progress in a number of different areas, so I'll touch on those. In terms of commercial contracts, we announced that we're working with Lawrence Lynch. They're located right on Cape Cod in Falmouth, and they're going to be opening the roads for us along the cable route, preparing the entire route on land on Cape Cod, where the cables will come ashore and continue to where they connect into the Barnstable substation. We announced that we're working with Prismian Cables and manufacturing and supplying both the onshore and offshore cables that we'll be using, and also working with Caldwell Marine, and they're going to be installing the offshore cables. Caldwell Marine is based in New Jersey. Prysmian has facilities around the world. They will be making our onshore cables in their South Carolina facility. We've been saying for a long time that we're going to be working with Siemens. They're going to be providing the turbines, but that was formalized in last December when we announced with Siemens we had an executed contract both for their 3.6 megawatt turbines, which really out of any of the offshore wind turbines in the world have been the most deployed and have the longest and arguably best track record at this point. And they're continuing to make them. I mean, their 3.6 turbines are being used in projects that are under construction now. We also announced just recently that we're doing the last of the survey work. We are working with a number of Massachusetts-based and Connecticut-based firms in this last survey program out on Horseshoe Shoal and along the cable route, and we expect to complete that in July. Another sort of grouping of announcements have been on project financing, and of course that's incredibly important, and that's really the phase that we're in now. We hope to complete project financing by the end of this year, and if we can do that, then the construction schedule will flow from that. We'll actually be beginning to construct this project next year, so that's exciting. So we've made some interim announcements on the financing side up until now. So we have some pieces that have come in place, and we have some more to do. Some of the pieces that have been identified so far, the lead commercial banks in Cape Wind's financing are going to be, acronym is BTMU, but it's Bank of Tokyo Mitsubishi, along with, and of course they're Japanese-based, along with Rabobank, which is Netherlands-based bank, and Natixis, which is French. They're kind of, the three banks are performing two roles. One is that they're themselves taking leading roles in providing commercial debt. So between the three of them will be north of $400 million in commercial debt, and they also are arranging the syndicate for the other commercial banks. So that work is underway now. Pension Denmark is going to be participating, providing mezzanine debt, and to the tune of about $200 million. And EKF, which is the Export Bank of Denmark, is providing $600 million. Then the other kind of category of announcements in the past 16 months have been legal. We've had a number of important court victories. As I speak to you right now, we are actually litigation free. That phase. I should ask you to hold your applause. That may not last very long. There may be appeals, but I think the important thing is that we to date have actually won 26 lawsuits. Project opponents have been very litigious. But as we say, Bill Koch may not run out of money to fight us, but he's starting to run out of courts. And they may try a few appeals, but we believe that weak appeals of strong decisions aren't going to go very far. So, but in the recent, really since the beginning of this year, in January, we had a big court victory on the FAA challenge project opponents have brought, and that one was significant because of all the lawsuits of all these years. The one lone temporary court win opponents ever had was in challenging what was the FAA's third approval, as they call it, determination of no hazard. But then the FAA went back to work and they came out with a fourth determination of no hazard, and that challenge is what was decided in January, and that was in favor of the FAA. So that was an important win. And then in last month, we had finally the long-awaited big decisions on the NEPA challenges. These were the challenges of the Department of Interior's approval to Cape Wind, and we won those challenges. There were two very minor procedural matters where the agencies were directed to do just a little bit more work, but we expect those filings to be in with the court very, very soon. And and then Judge Stearns, the federal district court in Boston, handed down a very significant legal decision just recently, this month, in which he dismissed what had been the quote-unquote new lawsuit project opponents had brought challenging our long-term power purchase agreement with NSTAR. And it's a higher legal bar to get a case dismissed. So we were very optimistic that would be the result, but very gratified when that decision came down. And even we were also gratified with the reasoning in the decision, and even some of the language that the judge used, very strong language, and really, I think, called the opponents for what they were doing, which is almost an abuse of the legal system. Vexatious abuse, I think, were the judge's words. And we're very, very pleased with that. And another thing doesn't quite raise to the level of some of these other announcements, but something I personally spent a great deal of time on is we did completely revamp the Cape Wind website. So some of you may have seen that, and if you haven't, I encourage you to go capewind.org. A wholesale change of what we had there before. Our original site was good, 12 years ago when we built it, but it had gotten very out of date, and it was also using a much older web architecture, which was difficult to work with and difficult to change. So we're very excited with the new website, and check it out if you haven't seen it. I do sometimes get asked why we're not capewind.com. It was already taken when Cape Wind came along 13 years ago. It's a motel in Falmouth. I think they've got a lot of web traffic over the years, so we're capewind.org. What's next steps? As I said, our game plan is to complete financing in the second half of this year. So continue to look for those financing-related announcements. And when you read the headline, you ever ask yourself when you'll really know on Cape Wind? It's when we've completed project financing. So when you read that headline, then you know we're really on our way, and construction will flow from there. So I hope that if I speak to you a year from now, I'll have some cool construction footage, photographs to be showing you, and be able to talk about that. So it's been a long road to get to this point. Many people in this room have helped us get to this point. We're appreciative of that, and look forward to the next steps.
I see a stream of people trying to make their way surreptitiously debating to the restroom. They are back behind the screen, so if you do need to go, please feel free to go. And we have Megan Amsler here with us next. Megan is a native Cape Codder, grew up on an organic farm. Since 2001, she's been the executive director of Self-Reliance, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to promote environmentally sound technologies and sustainable practices. Megan's got a wide knowledge of renewable energy technologies. She established Cape Cod's Million Solar Roofs Partnership. She's also very involved in workforce training, and as a partner of Ocean Readiness, she's working to establish the first hands-on technical offshore renewable energy training and development center in North America, which will provide technical, health, and safety training for offshore renewable energy workers. And take it away, Megan.
Thanks for having me here today. I'm going to talk to you about Ocean Readiness, which is a partnership that I am involved with 3 other partners. You can see here Ron Beck, who is with Offshore Renewable Safety and former U.S. Coast Guard guy who was involved in the permitting process of Cape Wind since its very early days. Tanya Maynard from Tuksud PMSS, and Whitman Consulting's Joel Whitman, who used to be the CEO of Global Marine. Next slide. Through this, I think Lauren did a great job sort of setting the stage, and Nils too, of what we need in terms of preparation from facilities, and that there are workers that are needed to be trained to actually get out there and give the U.S. workers opportunity to have some of these jobs, which, because we don't have any of this industry here currently, we have a bit of a curve. Through a lot of the work that I've been doing over the past 3 years, it has become incredibly apparent that contractors even that want to get into this, whether you're talking about unions or you're talking about the marine contractors that want to do the construction, they're really not totally sure how do the jobs all mesh up and what's the risk and what are the health and safety areas that they need to work on. So through Ocean Readiness, we have put together a bunch of expertise sort of under one umbrella, if you will. And part of it is to look at offshore health and safety standards and to do some evaluation, look at workforce development expertise from both onshore and offshore, to provide maritime regulatory expertise, so evaluation of specific project by project regulations that fall onto particular projects, and then actual installation issues that would come up along those lines. And so the services, we would start with risk identification and go all the way down through compliance verification and training as well. Next slide. I'm just trying to go faster. We have seen this map a few times, but here I just want to put it through the lens of the opportunities, right? We have a number of projects. Clearly, Cape Wind and Deepwater are being sort of ready to go, but overall, with the recent announcements for the pilot projects from DOE that came during the OEA conference, sort of the beginning of May, we see that there are numerous opportunities. Probably going to be seeing a few hiccups without work here, but the opportunity is definitely moving forward in the next 10 years. Next slide. So, part of this, what I was just talking about a second ago, is we need this workforce to be trained to a compliance standard that kind of doesn't exist, but kind of does. And we have a lot of regulatory compliance agencies from BOEM, BSEE, and OSHA, and the Coast Guard, but there's a lot of confusion in terms of what do I have to be compliant with if I am an iron worker or if I am a vessel crew fellow, what do I have, who's going to be inspecting me and these sorts of things. So as the workforce gets ramped up for this, we want to make sure that we are providing training that's consistent with the various requirements. And that here is an opportunity, within confusion, there's opportunity here. We can raise the bar and say, while OSHA may not be out there actually doing the inspections, everyone needs to be trained because we don't, this is the whole idea is zero harm. We don't want anyone to be hurt during the process of doing this work. And operating under a safety management system, which the developer, like Cape Wind or Deepwater, has to have these safety management systems. So there's, let's say, executive training as well as actual worker training that are, folks that are going to be technically working out, doing construction and operations and maintenance. Risk assessment is a huge thing. Working offshore is inherently dangerous, so figuring out when a go, no-go situation, how do you make those calls as it relates to the window of opportunity that has been set forth by the federal government of here's the time, your work window, and how does the financing get impacted if the project is off by a few weeks. All of these things are really important pieces that people need to get up the learning curve on. And then, of course, looking at lessons learned. And we look to the European experience along those lines. Because, again, we don't have a really strong health and safety culture for the wind. Wind has been sort of the Wild West. Land-based wind has been the Wild West, I would say, for the last 35 years. We're just sort of catching up on the health and safety side. We don't have that opportunity for the offshore. We don't want to make those mistakes. So we really have the opportunity to learn from the European experience. So the offshore, the training, again, I just mentioned we have zero harm as our, sorry, I'm jumping ahead here. Zero harm and really having that foundation of health and safety as the first and foremost principle. So we look at that in terms of risk assessment and looking from everything from foundation, all parts of construction need to be evaluated. And so doing a risk assessment with a specific company that is planning on doing work will be part of the services that are offered through this partnership. Next. And then a regulatory review, again, looking at the offshore maritime space, where, just go back in your mind's eye to that map that we've seen a bunch of times, are there projects that are in state waters? Your project is in state waters, Aileen. Cape Wind is in federal waters. So there are different regulations and requirements that fall for different projects. And so having this comprehensive review is an essential piece of the puzzle. Commercial training and development for above the water and below the water. This is something that, when we think about turbine construction, typically we just think about foundation, tower, and blades in the nacelle. For the offshore wind, there are lots of opportunities here for workers. And the vessels, we've back deck workers, we've got ROV operators, divers, underwater welders, cable installers. And the really unique thing about this is we don't have any workers in this country. And there's a need for these workers here as well as in the global marketplace. So if we train the workers, give them a good, strong educational background and a skills passport, they can then take these jobs overseas, get a little more experience, and come back when our wind industry gets moving again. Next slide. So the training, the North Atlantic Offshore Renewable Training and Development Center will be a facility where we will do everything from transfer vessel training, which I'll show you a slide in a second, learning to work in the gearboxes and do blade repair, all that sort of thing, as well as with the health and safety, again, being the foundation of all of that. The idea here is that we're working on obtaining a tower section. We have a memorandum of understanding with the Mass Maritime Academy in Buzzards Bay. The idea is to actually install one of these, the tower transition piece, because this is actually the most dangerous part of getting out to work every day, is making this transition from the vessel up the ladder. So we want to be able to train, not simulator training. This is not something you can do standing in some lab. This is something we want you to actually, if you're going to be working out there, you need to understand the rigor associated with this. And we're partnering with Guardline they're based in the UK, and they do this training. They also happen to make some of the transfer vessels. And so that's a really great thing. And the training for the vessel crew and operators and the STCW is also something that Mass Maritime also offers. So we're not reinventing the wheel here. Just a quick sort of overview of the opportunities here for a back deck and below the water. All of these pieces here, I just kind of quickly went through that, but think about it, and I have another slide that I'm borrowing from Coast Guard. But to show, everything comes, the power's got to get to the shore, and there's cable, and there's all kinds of pieces of this that we haven't been thinking about from the perspective of the land-based industry. Above the water, turbine installation technicians, and then operations and maintenance technicians. For training safety, again, because we're working in the offshore space, incredibly dangerous. So from firefighting, STCW, the transfer vessel I just talked about, and then Hewitt, which is the helicopter underwater egress training. That's another piece. So if you're actually out there and the Coast Guard needs to come and rescue you, there's a lot of training that needs to go on. Don't know that our local Coast Guard guys are familiar. Michelle, you might be able to speak to that. Getting people off the transition piece, and that whole training mechanism that has to take place just for our emergency responders. There are many levels of this. Next slide. Can you hit it a couple times? So this is a slide that I borrowed from Dan Hubbard at the Coast Guard, and it was originally to look at the regulatory space, but here I borrowed it because it's very nice. Can you hit it a couple more times, Liz? Keep going. One more. Again. Okay. I think that's good. So it also shows you from the training opportunities, right? There's heavy lifting, as Lauren pointed out from sort of that map that she had up there. Vessels, so you have got crew and vessels and everybody that goes out. If we go out as a Mass Wind working group says, hey, we're going to have a tour to go out to Cape Wind. There's a certain amount of training. You can't just hop on the vessel. If anybody's going to be making transition onto the turbines, there's absolutely training that needs to take place before people can go out on a vessel like this. Sea survival training, clearly that that comes with this whole transition out there. And then the technician training for construction, as well as the operations and maintenance. So short service employees, the various contractors that are going to be working on these projects will have the opportunity to be trained through our program. Next. We have also looked to Germany for a really great model, and we have found the BZEE curriculum, which was developed for the wind industry by the wind industry. And it's a very, very comprehensive curriculum that's out there. You may hear people talk about, things need to be to the GWO, which is the Global Wind Organization standard, or Renewable UK standard. That's all well and good, but there's no curriculum behind that. And so the bottom line is the BZEE curriculum has reciprocity with GWO and Renewable UK, but it actually exceeds the standards. So to me, that's a really key thing, because I don't want to train people that are going to be undertrained and underskilled for the job that they're going to be signing up for. So this program, we do all kinds of, there's climb training, confined space rescue, rescue from heights, rescue from depth, and then rotor blade inspection, which Rose talked about. Shimmying down the old front of the blade. As well as, these guys getting up into the nacelle and figuring out how the health of the generator is. We've had discussions with Siemens in terms of doing on-the-job training that would also qualify for practical internship time, because folks that want to go and become a full operations and maintenance technician program need 240 hours of hands-on exposure. And so Siemens has said, that's great. If this person, if a student is someone that we can hire, do on-the-job training, that can serve as two, specific Siemens training, as well as getting the student their hours. And then they would sit for the exam, which is a practical and a written exam. So the value is it's hands-on as well as theoretical. So from the modules that are available for offshore technicians, from a health and safety perspective, I touched on these a little bit before, but really, they're very comprehensive. Onward. So we need to get here. We just need to make sure we do it safely. That's it. Thanks.
Gordy Stewart, PhD student in wind energy at UMass. He's designing standards for floating offshore wind turbines. So we're going from turbines that have their anchors, foundations in the seabed, to floating offshore wind turbines. And he hopes to be finishing his dissertation early next year, so we're right behind him. Then we'll have Zara Dowling, who's going to talk about the wildlife impacts. And then finally we'll have Eileen Kenny, from Deepwater Winds. We're going to try to get you out of here according to our schedule, but we have run over a little bit. So take it away, Gordy.
All right, great. Yeah, the length of the PhD is one of those questions you never want to be asked, so I decided to put it in my bio so that nobody would have to ask me. But I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of what a floating offshore wind turbine is, and then what specifically my research is for floating wind turbines. Go ahead. So I guess people have shown similar maps to these, but I'm sort of trying to motivate offshore wind maybe not anybody in this room needs to be motivated, but basically there's really great wind out in the center of the country on land where not as many people live, but we live over here, and there's not much wind onshore in Massachusetts. However, we have this great offshore resource. The problem is that at a certain point on the East Coast, and especially the West Coast and the Great Lakes, it gets too deep to allow for conventional offshore, where you hammer a monopile down into the soil. Around 50 meters, there's some transitional depth, lattice type structures, but around 50 meters water depth, it becomes economically infeasible to have a monopile structure. So some of the new research that's going on in Europe and also in the US is the use of floating platforms. So this picture here shows 3 concepts for floating platforms. This is a spar buoy. It basically has a big mast at the bottom. It's like an inverted pendulum. This one's called a TLP, or a tension leg platform. Basically have tight mooring lines that hold the platform steady. And then over here, this is a barge type platform. Also, semi-submersibles fall into this, where it just uses a large floating, some sort of barge to hold the platform steady. And so there's some advantages with these platforms. One, like I said, the water depths. You can put them in basically any water depth you want. 2 is you can assemble these things possibly in port and then tow them out to where you want to install them, instead of having this sort of very expensive installation with the big pile driver ships. However, of course, there's increased costs. You have a lot more mass in this platform that you have to build. And now these things are farther from shore. You have to go out there to maintain them. So there are definitely some issues. One of the big issues is that we don't really know how these things behave in the water. There are only, I think, two or three operating floating platform wind turbines in the world right now. One of them is actually in the US. This is a picture down here. This is an iPhone through binoculars, which I did not think was going to work, but I took this picture of the UMaine turbine. And it's small scale. I think it's only 30 or 40 feet high. But it's, I guess, the U.S.'s first electricity producing offshore wind turbine. It also happens to be a floating wind turbine. Next slide. So some of the things that I'm working on in this sort of broader topic of floating wind turbines is, number one, what kind of conditions, wind and waves and currents, do these things experience during their lifetime? And then number 2, how do they respond to those conditions? And one big question is, I mean, offshore oil and gas has been doing floating platforms for their applications for 30 plus years. So there's a lot to learn from that. However, there's also huge differences. I mean, they don't have a gigantic spinning sail basically on top of their oil and gas platform that they have to worry about. So one of the things in oil and gas is that they do very long simulations. Their platforms are much bigger, and so they move a lot slower. And so they say you need at least a 6-hour simulation in order to accurately capture the load-in. In the wind industry, we usually say 10 minutes and you're good for onshore. So there's sort of this big gap as to what is feasible. And so that was one of the first questions I tried to answer. I'm not going to talk about that one too much. It's a little boring. But a more interesting one was what happens with wind and wave misalignment. So since wind causes waves in the ocean, usually they're aligned because the wind is causing the waves to be generated. But occasionally we'll have events, maybe there's a storm, off in the distance that's causing some waves to come in, and the wind is in a different direction. And with floating platforms, if the waves are coming in a different direction from the wind, the waves can cause extra motion in the off-axis direction. And this can be a pretty big deal, as I'll show later. And also, my grant is an IGRIT grant, and it's Zara's going to talk about some stuff about bats, but it's an interdisciplinary grant, so we're required to do one chapter in our thesis that's sort of combining your main focus with something else. And we do policy research and also environmental research. So I'm going to be doing some stuff about bird impacts of different layouts, how different wind turbine layouts affect birds. So the first thing I did, there's really no good source of meteorological ocean, I say mid-ocean, conditions in the U.S., at least specifically for wind turbine applications. So the NOAA, National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration, runs this National Data Buoy Center where they have floating data buoys all over the country. This map down here shows a couple of locations. All the ones in orange are the ones that I've downloaded. So I started off by just downloading tons of data. I think I had over 200 years combined data, and filtering through that, cleaning it up, and then making it useful for wind energy research. And I'm going to be publishing this data set at some point. And I'll stay tuned, but it'll be open source for any researchers. Next slide. So once I had that data, I could figure out, for example, when or how often wind wave misalignment occurred, and then use that probability distribution data to then run a loads analysis. So when I say wind wave misalignment, what I mean is here you can see the green arrow is the wind direction, and I assume that the wind always comes from 0 degrees. Obviously, it's all the way around, but really it's the angle between the wind and the waves that I care about. So the wind wave misalignment I've then defined as this angle between the wind and the waves. And so the wind and the wave directions are correlated, but they're not 100% correlated. So occasionally you'll have waves actually coming from the exact opposite direction as the wind. It's pretty rare, but so with the movement of the platforms, you can have this basically the loads in the side-side direction, say side-side, that's the direction that's 90 degrees to the wind direction. You can have higher loads in those directions. And another big problem is that in the side-side direction, basically it's difficult to move the wind turbine rotor into and out of the wind because it resists that motion. It's called aerodynamic damping. But in the side-side direction, there's no such aerodynamic damping. So if you have loading in that direction, you have the possibility of much more movement and much more loads. Thanks. So I ran close to 100 years of simulated wind turbine operation in all sorts of different conditions, including 24 wave misalignment angles, to try to figure out, okay, let's say we consider 24 angles, what are the loads? Let's consider 12 angles, what are the loads? So I went down, and these are just, that one's pretty hard to see, but basically these are the angles that I considered. So you can go all the way down to actually 2 angles, which just, if you're looking at 0 degree waves and 90 degree waves, and you capture pretty accurately what the loads are. If you only look at 0 degree, so that's aligned wind and waves, you lose the side-side tower loads. It took so much work to get to this plot, but it's not all that interesting. The main interesting thing is here. The tower side-side load right here, if you look at only 1 bins, that's 0 degree line waves, you're under-predicting by about 50%. So that's a big deal. If you design your tower to withstand 50% of the load that you actually are getting, it would break. And another interesting thing is that you're actually over-predicting the fore-aft loads if you only consider aligned wind and waves, because you're saying that 100% of the time the waves are coming in the direction of the wind, so you're actually over-predicting those loads. So you design it stronger for that sense. So the takeaway was that consider at least 2 directions and you capture your loads correctly. But it took a lot to get to that point. So next slide. All right, so I'm going to talk about, this is maybe the more interesting stuff, or the more fun stuff anyway. So there's a researcher in Great Britain, Elizabeth Masden, who basically took some radar data for a common eider, which is right here. And so this plot here shows each line can actually be a flock of up to some number of birds. But basically, these are birds coming from the right, and they're heading towards this offshore wind turbine array, and then they're either going around it or some go through. And so she made a mathematical model that tried to predict the movement of these birds. And it looks about like this. So this is actually a mathematical model where they seed the directions. This is a common migration direction for these birds. Next slide. So the problem was that in this paper, I mean, this was written by an environmental science person. So in the paper, they show, okay, let's take our model and apply it to different wind farm shapes. And they show a couple that they basically take all the turbines and put them into one tiny little area, and they're like, the birds go around it, and they, don't get hit. But from an engineer, I read the paper, I was like, oh man, you can't do that. You wouldn't get any power because the wind is going to, the wakes are all going to hit each other. So what I'm trying to do is sort of combine wake effects and this sort of bird movement prediction model. So I'm using it's called a genetic algorithm, and I'm basically trying to place the turbines in the array with also trying to reduce the amount of flight time that the birds have through the turbine array. And I had a movie that showed the optimization, the algorithm as it went, but I don't think it's going to work. Yeah, if you try to just click on this picture. Yeah, I tried it earlier, but yeah. Nope, okay. Well, I can explain what it looks like. If you go back, yeah. So basically, this is, you start off with the blue dots are wind turbines. The birds in this are coming from the left to the right. And this starts off with just a random array, so just randomly place the turbines down on there, and then it iteratively tries to figure out the best solution so that the birds can fly straight through without having to go around the turbines. And for this configuration of bird flights, this is pretty preliminary results, but it basically turns out almost like an hourglass shape. So it puts most of the turbines up in this region, and then sort of some back here. So basically the birds get in, they kind of get funneled down to a point, and then they see the turbines behind them and get out of town. So it was more of a proof of concept. I mean, that's not actually how birds approach a turbine, but the next step is to link this model with a sort of a very general power production model that tries to put the turbines farther apart for wake losses, and then sort of be able to have a sliding scale where I say, okay, I only care about birds, what does the wind farm look like? And it'll probably be all crammed together. And then I only care about power, what does it look like? It'll probably be, maximizing the space. And then sort of the designer can say, okay, I care a little bit about birds, or 50% about birds, what does it look like? It'll at least give some sort of tool for placement of the turbines. And with the idea that for a floating farm, you're less constrained by the ground, so you can have more freedom to place the turbines wherever you want. So yeah, that's it. Thanks.
I kind of gave you a little bit, but she obviously is in the offshore wind program as well, but more focused on environmental impacts of offshore wind. Thank you. I'm going to get the light.
Yeah, so Jody asked me to talk a little bit about the impacts of offshore wind on wildlife. And I wanted to kind of preface this by saying that there's a lot that we don't know about what the long-term effects and the cumulative effects of offshore wind are going to be. And because of that, I think a lot of ecologists kind of take a cautious approach and they say, well, this is a relatively new technology, we don't know what the risks are going to be, maybe we should kind of be slow in our development of offshore wind. But also, next slide, we have this kind of elephant in the room of global warming, where it's like, well, we really do need to develop renewable energy to deal with climate change. And so on the one hand, you have offshore wind where we don't know exactly what the impacts are going to be, and then you have climate change where we also don't know exactly what the impacts are going to be, but we assume they're going to be quite serious. So trying to find that balance can be difficult, and next slide. that can be especially true in the offshore environment where you have this kind of vast habitat. If you just are looking out at the ocean, it's just kind of even initially a lot more difficult than a terrestrial landscape where you can say, okay, well, there's trees here, so there'll be, forest-dwelling birds or something like that. It can be a lot more difficult. And also just the logistics of surveying and placing sampling equipment out in the ocean can be very difficult. But having said that, I think that we've made a lot of progress from moving from the kind of questions of, well, we don't really understand the ecology of a lot of these species, to focusing in on what are the exact questions that we need to answer to address offshore wind risk in particular, where are the areas of high impact likely to be, and what research questions do we need to answer to address that. So I'm just going to kind of go through some of the species that we think there might be an impact of offshore wind on and talk about what we know and kind of the research questions that we still have to address. So marine mammals and sea turtles, you've heard a little bit about this so far today, and that's one area where I think we've really narrowed down well. We know that during the construction phase is likely to be one of the major areas of impact due to the noise of monopile construction. And then also during construction and deconstruction, there's a lot more vessel traffic, and that can lead to more risk of collision. So making sure that for rare marine mammal species, you do that construction outside of the season when they're moving through the area. It can be it might be kind of an onus because it limits your schedule, but at least it's a pretty straightforward way to limit impacts. And also, there may be minimal to moderate impacts due probably on a pretty localized scale to electromagnetic fields, and then maybe on a slightly broader scale to noise during operation. So if you can keep, in terms of siting, keeping wind farms outside of the really important calving grounds, breeding grounds, and feeding grounds for kind of the rare marine mammals and rare sea turtles that you can really have reduce your impact on these species. And then in terms of marine birds, we heard a little bit about this from Gordy. But it's kind of interesting if you're coming from a terrestrial perspective to know that collision risk for marine birds is not such a big deal, at least on kind of a population level, and that more of the issue is going to be displacement. So sort of similar to the picture he showed, this is a study that began in 2007 where they tracked, using radar, goose flight paths through these two wind development areas. And as you can see, this is kind of before turbines are in the water and the birds are moving through those areas, and then this is 2009 and 2010 with construction. They're really avoiding, especially this northern area, they've just totally avoided, and also the southern area to some extent. So there's this real displacement issue. And if the birds are just using this as a flyaway, there's some cost due to the fact that they can't make a straight flight through. They have to avoid the turbines, and so that's kind of a problem. But if this is a major foraging habitat and they can't land in this area because they're frightened away by the turbines, it becomes a real issue for them in terms of not getting to the feeding grounds that they need to get to. And because of that, a lot of people have been doing these surveys and trying to figure out what are the major foraging habitats and how do we avoid siting wind turbines in those areas. I think another thing that's kind of interesting about marine birds that one of the students in our program, Andrew Allen, is working on is this idea that they might be good indicator species of what's going on below the ocean surface. So if these marine birds are feeding on fish and the fish are feeding on plankton, the marine birds might be a really good indicator of what are these biodiversity hotspots. And so he's been doing a lot of work of kind of taking a look at these surveys and laying different species on top of each other and seeing how well they overlap. So that's one potential. So that's kind of also, so with sighting that you may be able to think about marine birds and use that to also sight to avoid areas that are important areas for fish and plankton and the seabed in general. I think one thing that people kind of tout often as a potential benefit of offshore wind turbines is that they could serve as artificial reefs. And that's definitely something that could be the case where they kind of serve as areas where fish congregate. But I think in terms of these biodiversity hotspots, we don't know exactly what the effect of the turbines are going to be. And if you're placing them in an area that already has really high biodiversity and you don't know what the effects of adding all these hard surfaces, scour, wave patterns, sediment deposition, that could kind of be a concern because, why break this thing that's working is sort of the idea. So that can be kind of a challenge because shallow areas, which are often good for biodiversity, are also good for building offshore wind turbines, but it's sort of one area that probably needs more study. Moving above the ocean surface, a species that you might not think about having to worry about are bald eagles. And we know onshore that out west, especially golden eagles get hit by wind turbines, and that bald eagles, to some degree, that's a problem, and that there may also be displacement effects. And we have a student who's working on looking at eagles' movement around wind turbines up in Maine, and he noted that it's important that you might not think about it, but you actually have to consider bald eagles off the coast when you're looking at offshore wind too. So if you're really far out, if you're probably more than about 20 kilometers, there's probably not going to be a lot of eagle movement offshore, but at least in a kind of an environment like Maine where you've got this complicated coastline where there's a lot of islands and a lot of peninsulas, it can become an issue, and you really do need to think about eagles when you're siting your wind farm. Songbirds can also be an issue. We know from terrestrial sites that about 80% of bird mortality has been from songbirds, and we think that that's likely to be more of an issue offshore. The birds aren't just kind of using that habitat all year, but when they're migrating through an area, they quite often are migrating through coastal areas, and they're likely to be more at risk from collisions for a couple of reasons. They typically fly at pretty high heights, between 200 and 800 meters, but they tend to fly lower over water and in bad weather and foggy conditions, which you often have along the coast. And then a lot of the collisions also occur during foggy weather with their attraction to lights, and obviously, so if you have lights on the wind turbines, or you have a lighthouse nearby, something that's bringing them in, then there's a good chance they're going to get hit. And in terms of that, that's something that's really an area where we need a lot more study, and one of the students in our program is looking at how far songbirds are moving offshore. They're such a small animal that they're often difficult to study, but people have been putting these kind of little nano tags on them and tracking their movements down the coast. So that's one area where we need more study, but where sighting will probably also come into play. And then I was going to finish talking briefly about some of my work. I'm working on long-distance migratory bats. We have 3 species that kind of move up and down the east coast, and that's the hoary bat, the eastern red bat, and the silver-haired bat. And you might not really think about bats as kind of an issue over the ocean, especially with offshore wind, but it turns out there's this long anecdotal history of stories of people seeing bats migrating offshore, sometimes up to 100 miles offshore, and stories of sailors waking up in the morning and finding these migratory bats roosting in the mast of their ships. So this one's from 1921. So there's this long history of it, and it turns out from recent surveys, they did some acoustic work along the coast of Maine, and they found out that there was actually more bat activity in coastal areas than there was inland, and that at these offshore buoys, it was sort of equivalent, probably a little bit less, but not significantly less than in coastal sites. So they're definitely present offshore. And in terms of mortality at onshore sites, we know that they comprise about 75% of mortality, so they're probably at risk offshore. And I think this is an interesting case because as opposed to sighting, which seems to be the answer for a lot of species, I don't think that's really going to be the answer for bats for a couple of reasons. One, because they are so difficult to study, and figuring out what their migratory pathways are, given the fact that there's a sort of vast ocean they could be migrating off of, and that in terms of placing survey equipment out in the ocean, just the logistics of doing that are very difficult. And the survey methods we have, a detector is only going to pick them up if they're within 30 meters of the detector. So I think in terms of identifying migratory pathways, that's going to be very difficult. Also, bats tend to be attracted, we think, to wind turbines. And they're especially going to be attracted in an offshore environment where, if they're landing on sailing ships, they're going to be excited about landing on wind turbines, and they actually have found that in Europe that they do roost on wind turbines. So I don't think that sighting is really going to solve our problem, but I think that if we think about curtailment options, they're really only vulnerable in at the most a 3-month period as they're moving through an area, which I think if you get site to site, you can limit that down. And then knowing the weather conditions, these low wind conditions, often nights of low moonlight, really narrowing in on what are the weather conditions that they're moving under so that curtailment can be limited. And I know a lot of wind turbine operators aren't excited about curtailment. But hopefully deterrents are also an option. People have been working on ultrasonic deterrents, and I've actually been exploring the idea of radar as a deterrent. So I think that this is a problem that we can solve, or at least minimize. Thank you.
That's probably the one that says 2014 Mass Military Reservation. Number of my files. There it is. So, he's very brief here with my introduction. Aileen Kenny is the Vice President of Permitting and Environmental Affairs at Deepwater Wind, which is located in the province of Rhode Island. She is the person responsible for overseeing the environmental surveys and the permitting of Deepwater Wind, which includes projects off the coast of Rhode Island, New Jersey, New York, and Massachusetts. Eileen has worked on the permitting of wind and other energy projects in the United States and abroad for over 10 years. And I'm going to cut it short and let you just jump into it.
And I'll be brief. I think a lot of people have already covered with a lot of the great presentations. So thanks for inviting me and having us here. We're excited. We're excited to be part of this industry in Massachusetts and in New England. And we recently announced on the West Coast as well. So Deepwater Wind, we are a Providence-based developer of only offshore wind projects. We have projects in Rhode Island. We have the Block Island Wind Farm, which I'll talk a little bit more about. We also recently won leases from BOEM for their REMA, the Rhode Island, Massachusetts Wind Energy Area. Off the coast of New Jersey, we're partnered with PSEG, which is their local utility down there. We have a project, a company called Garden State Offshore Energy, or GSOE, where we have an interim policy lease from BOEM, and we currently have a buoy that's doing met data collection, and we hope to build one of the first projects off the coast of New Jersey as well. We recently announced a partnership with Principal Power, who are on the west coast, off the coast of Oregon, Coos Bay, and they actually have a floating turbine technology, which BOEM just announced today that they'll be proceeding with an environmental assessment as part of the permitting for that project. So that project is moving along as well. So we're excited. We have a lot going on, and we love offshore wind. So I think we can move on. So the Block Island Wind Farm is a project that's in state waters, and it's 5 6-megawatt wind turbines, and we have a 20-year PPA with National Grid. Block Island is currently not connected to the mainland grid. They have some of the highest power prices in the country during the summer. No one on Block Island, even like Christopher Walken and Hollywood stars, very few people have air conditioning. So if anybody's looking for a business, open up an air conditioning shop on Block Island after we go into service, and you'll do all right. But so we, part of our agreement is that we have to connect Block Island to the mainland, and that's a separate project called the Block Island Transmission System. National Grid will be purchasing this portion of the project from us, and Deepwater Wind will own and operate the offshore wind turbine. So just drawing some from some of our previous presenters, Rhode Island did an ocean marine spatial planning effort. It was called the Rhode Island Ocean Special Area Management Plan. And they actually identified the zone within which offshore energy could be located. And it's this hatched area here. It's called the Renewable Energy Zone. So when we set out to site our turbines within the zone, we did a lot of environmental assessment. And what we found, which Zara said, is that in areas where there was harder, rockier bottom, like the southwest coast of Block Island, it was essential fish habitats. It was very important to the benthic species. There were more fish there. There were more birds there because the birds were eating the fish. So it was just a really much more diverse and active area. And the good news is it's also an area that's not attractive for us from a construction point of view. We don't want to be in rocky bottom, which is a good synergy with the environmental concerns that we have and that others share. So we are over here in the northeast corner of the renewable energy zone. It's sandy bottom. The whole cable and the whole route back to the mainland is all sited in Sandy Bottom. That's why we go out here to avoid the Point Judith Shoal. So during our siting and some of our studies, we look for these more sensitive areas, and it's always our goal to avoid them. It's not good for the environment if we're in them. It also costs a lot more, and delays offshore, or time offshore is just very, very costly. So where we're at with Block Island is we have gotten all of our local permits. We are so happy to announce that we have our state permits. The Rhode Island Coastal Resources Management Council voted unanimously on May 13th to approve the project. And it was just wonderful to be in the room. Drew was there, and it was electric. They were talking about how this is so important, especially for a state like Rhode Island that's so vulnerable to sea level rise and climate change, something that we share all around New England. So it was just a really powerful night for offshore wind. And so now we're waiting on our federal permits, which we expect to have during June. And we'll be moving into construction next summer. So what we're planning to do is install the foundations late next summer, and then come back in 2016 and install the cable, starting in Narragansett to Block Island, and block out to the wind turbines, and also the turbines for a commercial operation date of 2016. So this is our version of a map you've seen. This is the northern portion of the Rhode Island, Massachusetts renewable energy zone. Wind energy area. This is our project that we're calling Deepwater 1. We have proposed this project into a power purchase agreement, RFP, that the Long Island Power Authority has. And our first phase of it is for 35 wind turbines with 200 megawatts. So, you know, it's always a balance, right? So you can say there can be 1,200 megawatts out there. Well, when I go to talk to the fishermen, that gives them so much anxiety. And then, you know, when you think about the Massachusetts wind energy area having 5,000 megawatts, it really, you know, it's really trying to find the balance, right? So really what we're looking for here in our first phase is 200 megawatts into Long Island, and we'd love to sell a couple hundred more megawatts into Massachusetts. So you've seen this map. This is a little bit of a closer up view. Block Island's here. These are the two wind energy areas. We hold the leases for those, and the auction for this area should be coming out later this year. Cape Wind's up there. Bowen said that they're going to, quote, get creative with the Massachusetts wind energy area. So we'll wait and see what that leasing opportunity looks like. So one of the things that I really wanted to focus on here is just the permitting. So permitting is my area, and it's very, very complex. When you hear about the time frame for wind, it's really a lot of it is driven by the permitting and, you know, things like the appeals that anybody can file, and really just the burden that we're under. So, you know, I think that the permitting process really starts very early when we do our early stakeholder outreach and engagement with the fishing community, the Native American tribes, with the NGOs and other marine stakeholders. And so we're required to get permits from a whole host of federal agencies, also state agencies, and also the municipalities where the cables come ashore, which can be the trickiest part of the project. So, you know, one of the things that Zara mentioned was trying to time your construction so that you're not there when the marine mammals are there. And one of the things that we, you can go to the next slide, the key siting issues we have are really marine mammals, fishing issues, tribal issues, avian, bat, visual, and then really other ocean users as well. So just a couple highlights of things that we're doing as an industry that, you know, to help to hopefully bring more of these stakeholders to be able to support us. For marine mammals in the Rhode Island, Massachusetts wind energy area, we recently signed an agreement with National Wildlife Federation, CLF, the Sierra Club, NRDC, and some other NGOs that creates additional restrictions on top of what BOEM requires to protect the North Atlantic right whale, and that includes restrictions on any activity during, from May 1st until, from October to May. It kind of excludes any noise-producing activities. You know, it is a big give by the industry because our guys want to be out there and they want to be constructing. At the same time, it's our shops offshore in the winter. So, you know, really balancing the environmental and the real true engineering and construction constraints. We were all able to come to the table together and come to an agreement. Specific to fishing, for Block Islands, this is some pictures from our from our trawl surveys. We're doing 3 years of pre-construction demersal fish trawl surveys, 1 year during construction, 2 years post-construction. We're doing a complementary study for lobsters. We're really trying to take some of the unknown out of these kind of environmental issues. We're doing similar studies for avian and bat. And really, Block Island's great. It's close to shore. It's a demonstration project. The scale is manageable. So we're hoping that through that project, we'll be able to better understand what the true concerns are and really be able to cite and design in the future to address them. And you know, one of the other things that it's not just the environmental. There's a lot of other stuff going on out there. You know, there's travel lanes. The DOD is very active. They have areas where they do torpedo testing. I don't think they really shoot torpedoes, but they pretend they're firing them. There's a lot of different areas where you can't be. So there's a lot that goes on out in the ocean, even though you look out and it seems empty. There's a lot going on above it and below it. So this is just a summary, I think, just so you all can see just the studies that we do. We're doing a lot out there. It starts several years before our applications go in. It goes during construction, it goes after construction. Each project gets completed. Cape Wind, Block Island, they'll all build on one another so that our industry can get a better understanding of what the impacts are. We also do geophysical and geotechnical studies, and this is where the Native American tribes come in. For Block Island, we had representatives of the Narragansett Indian tribe, which is a federally recognized tribe in Rhode Island, and also the Wampanoag tribe was gay head of the Aquinnah. They were on our vessels. They participated in the interpretation of the results, and the Narragansett showed up at the meeting to support the project. So I think that we've you know, we're all kind of learning and moving forward and trying to bring more of the, educate more of the stakeholders and bring them to the table early and often so that we can have successful projects. So I think that, you know, my punchline is that offshore wind is great for Massachusetts for all the reasons you've heard today. It is economic. It's one of the most cost-effective, large-scale sources of new energy for Massachusetts. It's reliable, it delivers power when the peak load in the middle of the day. We can use ports, we can use New Bedford, we can have the economic development aspect of it, which is so critically important for cities like New Bedford, and it will create hundreds of jobs. I mean, we heard about the training opportunities today. It really is something that it's not just an environmental issue, it's not just a climate change issue, it's a whole, it's an issue for the whole society. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. But
Well, we have about 15 minutes for some questions. If anybody needs to take up a little bit early, no problem, but we have an awful broad range of presentations, expertise, and here's our first guest.
Okay. A few questions, but I'll focus on one at a time. Mark, what is mezzanine debt?
Mezzanine debt is meant to mean kind of, well, you know, in a theater, it's in the middle of the seating chart for the theater. The mezzanine is in between orchestra and balcony. Well, in a financing sense, it's similar meaning in that it's in between debt and equity, essentially. It has characteristics of both. Yeah.
Preferred stock or something like that?
Well, it's you know, equity is high risk, high reward. Debt is low risk, low return, and mezzanine is in between. A medium amount of risk and a medium amount of return.
Okay, anybody else? Here's one, Kathy.
I'm not sure exactly how to put this, but if this was, rather than a wind turbine, if it was an oil or gas extraction facility off of Texas or Louisiana, the federal government would get royalties on the extraction and the state shares in that. I don't know whether the leases are a good deal. I think that that's maybe one form of subsidy that fossil fuel gets. But for wind turbines, what does the state get, if they get anything at all, on the production? Yeah, and maybe even the lease. And do the localities where the cables come ashore get anything?
Well, I can speak to that. You know, in the case of offshore wind, there's no extraction activity, and with offshore oil and gas, the payment, the royalties are tied to extraction. But there is an occupancy where you have structures that are occupying seabed and water column. So there are rents and royalties that are part of the Cape Wind lease and will be part of the other offshore wind project leases as well. So there are payments that Cape Wind will be making to the federal government, of which 27% will be redirected back to the neighboring state, which in our case is Massachusetts. We also have a community host agreement with the town of Yarmouth, where our cables come ashore that provide the town with tax revenues.
Yes, sir.
Why are the regulations that apply to oil rigs not directly applicable to the construction safety of the wind power?
So somebody, Megan have to leave? Oh, she did have to leave?
But somebody else must have some experience with that observation.
You may be finding that they have quite a bit of correlation.
Yeah, there are definitely applicable standards, and there are some differences too. But certainly, you know,
doesn't seem to be a new issue. It seems to be just applicable to a different end use to me.
Right.
I mean, like a rescue from a tower should be the same as rescue from a rig.
I know I had to have my training, and it was all based on, it's universal to some degree, how you get in on and off of the boats to the platform. Any other questions? Kathy, will you get somebody else? Yeah.
Aileen, your deep water wind project in Block Island, you said it was in state waters.
Yep.
Who's actually erecting the turbine towers and nacelles?
We haven't let that contract yet. We're just working. We have an out for bid right now for the cable, and this summer we'll be going out for a contract. I think that we have Alstom, who's the turbine manufacturer. Part of their contract is the erection, so I think that specific to the erection, they'll be doing that.
They're foreign?
They're French.
They're French. So
But GE well, I don't know if they're going to buy them, or Siemens, it's all over the news. Siemens is now going to buy them. So now they might be German.
I'm sorry, but the
Danish.
The
Sorry.
I was going to get to the Jones Act. How can they
the
get
Jones
around
Act,
the Jones
yeah.
Act?
So they,
Let's explain the Jones Act for a few people who may not be familiar with it.
you can explain it if
Well,
you'd
I'm
like.
going to try to explain it.
I mean, I can try it, but I'm not.
Basically, it's an international law that boats, that you have to use a boat that is from the home port, that within a certain distance of the land, the country's land.
Intra-coastal transport.
Intercoastal transport
Has to
in
be
the
an
U.S.
American-made vessel manned by American crews.
Right. So they'll never come to shore. They'll
So the
just
challenge is,
go.
of
They'll
course-
go straight to the wind
But they're
turbine.
within state waters, isn't that the same as?
Yeah, they have a ruling on that, our guys, but they just pick them up and put them right on. So you have to come to port, and then that's how you make it interstate. But
A loophole.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's not going to create any jobs building vessels here, though.
You know, Black Island's only 5 turbines, so it wouldn't really justify building a vessel for it. You know, our bigger project, I think it would definitely. There would be a lot more activity.
Is deep water pushing anyone with shipyards such as J. Cashman to start building vessels? Or?
No, not yet. Not for the bigger project. I think that we're happy to see that New Bedford is coming along. We have Quonset Port in Rhode Island, so we'll take advantage of what's there. There's a lot of money going in.
Do you have a new question? Yeah.
I have a question. I don't know as much about offshore as onshore, but I've heard a lot of interesting information here today. But the one thing I was hoping to hear about was where is the discussion of, have there been any advancements in storage capacity? Because for offshore wind to be successful, what I've been told is that we need to have advances in the ability to store. And I haven't heard that discussed here today. But
Well, I wouldn't really agree with that premise, because I think that Nils touched on this. The offshore wind production is actually much closer to that of electric demand than land-based wind production is. So where land-based wind farms,
because
just the time of day that the wind blows. So
better wind resource.
you have more consistent wind, and you have a better correlation of when the wind is producing, when the demand is occurring. So for example, you think of a dog day of August, right, where it's a hot day, but the winds on land might not be blowing all that well. Well, offshore, by the afternoon, you generally have, because of the sea breeze effect, you have a nice wind production taking place that corresponds with when the electricity is actually most needed. That is not to say, however, that it would not be nice if there were some breakthroughs in the storage, so we had this kind of cheap storage. That would be very good for solar, it would be very good for wind, it would be good for offshore wind, and let's hope it comes. But in the meantime, I think offshore wind compares reasonably well in terms of even without that, being able to plug in when the power is needed the most.
I just wanted to quickly add to that something that we talked about at the last working group meeting we heard from the ICE7 was that the independent system operator that runs the regional grid here in New England, and this is happening in other regional wholesale markets, they have a wind forecast model so that they know a day ahead roughly how much energy is going to be coming out of the wind projects, and so that they can basically dial up and down the dispatch of the other wind generators and the other dispatchable generators, so that the generation is meeting load. And the mechanisms in the wholesale market that are being adapted and implemented to get the most out of the wind production capacity is coming along in a really, really significant way.
yes, Carl.
This question is for Ms. Dowling. I was curious about the curtailment issue for migratory birds. I know that Mass Audubon has worked closely with the city of Boston on lights in buildings. I don't know if you're familiar with that in your work. Could you elaborate a little bit more on how there could be radar forecasting as migratory birds are coming down? I understand they go up the middle of the country coming up, and then they go down the eastern seaboard going down in the fall. Did you study that? And if you did, can you tell me, is there a way to predict when they're coming where operators could shut down for a few hours when the birds are passing?
Yeah, so I'm definitely not an expert on that. I've mostly been focusing on bats. But the little I do know is that people are using even the NextRad, like the National Doppler radar that they use for weather. You can sometimes track large movements of birds off the coast. So that's one option that people are working at. And then kind of on a close range, they're talking about having systems that are, I think, mounted on the turbines that are within a close range picking up radar of birds moving in towards the turbines, so you could shut them down temporarily. I think with eagles, it was like even individual birds.
So I deal with this all the time. And, everybody says, oh, curtail, but, realistically, you can't just shut them down because there's a flock of birds coming. It's just not that straightforward. And it's, I think that the thing is that at least offshore, onshore has different issues, but offshore, when it's, the bigger issue, the risk is elevated when it's cloudy, and when it's foggy, not cloudy, when it's foggy and the birds have compromised visibility. Well, usually if it's fogged in, there's not a lot of wind, so the turbines are not producing anyway. So there's often, there can be a correlation between the riskier times of the migration and when the turbines might actually be off already. But then, I think that there's already a lot that goes into the planning, and we work a lot with Fish and Wildlife Service to do different levels of risk assessment. And our goal is to not have to curtail, but what we're finding offshore is that the time when folks would like to curtail often correlates when we're not producing anyway. So it's an ongoing dialogue, but that's kind of where we're at.
And I would say really briefly with bats that they tend to be active during low wind speeds less than 6 meters per second.
Right.
So
we're shut down anyway at that point.
Yeah, they're usually shut down anyway, or sometimes onshore they just kind of raise the cut-in speed for the wind turbines and be able to cut mortality.
But because we cut in at a higher speed offshore, it does tend to be a little bit less of an issue than onshore.
Thank you.
We have reached the magic hour of 4:30, and I will hand it back to Jody for her wrap-up.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, and a special thanks to the panel and to Rose and to Liz and to our